By early afternoon, the temperature was just perfect. Not too hot, not too cool. The sky was a soft blue, brushed with a few lazy clouds, drifting like ships without sails. I poured myself a tall glass of iced tea, grabbed my favorite lawn chair, and stepped outside to the front yard. The grass was freshly cut from the day before, still holding the faint scent of greenery. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and felt the warmth of the sun touch my skin. There I was, sitting quietly in my own yard, completely content, expecting absolutely nothing but silence and stillness. But as peaceful as that moment was, it wasn't going to last. The calm before the storm, as they say. It began with a distant sound, not a bird, not a lawnmower, but footsteps. Sharp, determined, almost militaristic footsteps that crunched over gravel and echoed off the sidewalk. I opened my eyes and turned my head slightly. Across the street, from behind a meticulously trimmed hedge, emerged a woman who looked like she had walked straight out of a community newsletter. She was in her mid to late 50s, hair coiled into a tight bun that didn't move, even as the wind danced through the neighborhood, wearing a pastel pink blouse tucked into beige slacks and large sunglasses that seemed more like a shield than an accessory. She clutched a clipboard tightly to her chest, the way a knight would hold a shield during battle. Her walk was brisk, authoritative, as if every step was practiced. I had never seen her before, but her energy said everything. She was someone used to control, to being listened to having the last word. She didn't walk toward me. She marched, and I wasn't sure if I should wave or run. I offered a polite smile and a friendly nod. After all, this was the suburbs. Wasn't this the place where neighbors exchanged baked goods and waved from their driveways? She didn't return the gesture. Instead, she stopped 5 feet away from me and began what felt like a well-rehearsed script. "Excuse me," she said, voice crisp and clipped like she was reciting a rule book, "but you can't sit here." I blinked. "Sorry." She narrowed her eyes behind those giant sunglasses. "This is a private community. Sitting in your front yard requires compliance with HOA guidelines. Are you even a resident here?" At first, I genuinely thought she was joking. I gave a small laugh and stood up, trying to keep things light. "Yes, ma'am. I moved in just a couple weeks ago. Closed on this place myself." I pointed toward the front door, where the welcome mat still had the corner folded up from the movers. She didn't even glance. "Until your registration with the HOA is complete and your residency has been verified, you are not permitted to make use of front yard space. That includes lounging, personal decor, and any visual disruptions." Visual disruptions? My lawn chair wasn't neon. Tea wasn't leaking onto the sidewalk. I wasn't blasting music or inviting the entire block over for a barbecue. I was just sitting. I paused, unsure whether to laugh again or ask if there were cameras filming this for some ridiculous reality show. Her face remained blank, frozen in righteous confidence. And that's when I realized she was serious. Dead serious. I was speechless. All I wanted was to enjoy my first quiet day in years. And now this woman, this stranger, was telling me I couldn't even sit in my own yard. She wasn't a neighbor coming to introduce herself. She was a gatekeeper, the self-appointed guardian of all things proper and permitted in this perfect little suburbia. And unfortunately for her, she had no idea who she was talking to. At first, I thought this encounter would end the way most neighborhood misunderstandings do, with a shrug, maybe an awkward apology, and a hasty retreat. But I quickly realized that this woman, Cheryl, though I didn't know her name at the time, had absolutely no intention of backing down. As she stood there with her phone still in hand, she stared me down like a judge preparing to issue a verdict. Her fingers tapped rapidly across the screen, and within seconds, I could hear the unmistakable tone of a call being placed. "Yes, I'd like to report a trespasser," she said into the phone, loud enough for both me and the nearby neighbors to hear. "Yes, he's sitting on a lawn at 481 Maple Grove Lane. He doesn't belong here." She paused, nodding as if the person on the other end could see her. "He's refusing to leave. He's becoming hostile. Hostile." I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't moved. I was still holding my glass of iced tea. I took a deep breath and reminded myself of every calming technique I'd ever learned. I didn't want a scene, I didn't want to be the headline of someone's Facebook rant or next-door gossip thread. But I also wasn't going to be bullied, especially not in front of my own house. "Ma'am," I said as evenly as I could, "I live here. I own this home. There must be some kind of misunderstanding." Cheryl scoffed. "That's what they all say," she muttered. "We've had incidents before. Squatters, people trying to claim properties. This neighborhood has rules for a reason." Looked around, hoping a neighbor might speak up. Few stood at their doorways, watching the scene unfold like spectators at a play. One older gentleman across the street, watering his garden, looked particularly uneasy, but no one said a word. The silence was heavy, the kind of silence that feels like complicity. Cheryl finished her call and crossed her arms with a satisfied smirk. "They'll be here shortly." "I hope so," I replied, standing slowly, "because I'd like to clear this up once and for all." I took a long sip of my iced tea, set it on the porch rail, and leaned against one of the columns. Inside, my heart was racing, not out of fear, but frustration, anger, sadness even. I had worked my entire life to afford this home. And now, just days after moving in, I was being accused like a criminal for sitting in my own yard. About 10 minutes later, the unmistakable sound of sirens pierced the quiet afternoon. It's not blaring. Just that subtle whoop that police vehicles use when they want to cause a panic. 2 black and white squad cars rolled to a stop in front of my house, their lights flashing lazily in the dappled sunlight. Neighbors emerged from their homes like moths to a flame. Alsomes were out. Some filmed, others just stared. The scene had officially escalated beyond anything I had expected. 2 officers stepped out. One tall, built like a linebacker, and the other shorter. With kind eyes and a notepad already in hand, they approached me first. "Afternoon, sir. We received a call about a possible trespasser. Can we see some ID, please?" I nodded, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. "Of course, officers." I reached into my wallet and handed them my driver's license. The shorter one scanned it, his brow furrowing as he read the address. The same address printed on my mailbox, not 10 feet away. He looked up. "This is your property?" "Yes. I closed on it 2 weeks ago. I can also provide mortgage documents, utilities, or anything else you need." The taller officer turned toward Cheryl, who was now trying and failing to maintain her confidence. "Ma'am, is there any reason you believe this man didn't live here?" "He wasn't on the HOA roster yet," she said quickly, "and he was just sitting there. No one had introduced him. I've never seen him at a meeting." The officer raised an eyebrow. "So you called 911 because someone was sitting in a chair on their own lawn?" Cheryl's face turned a deep shade of pink. "I was doing my duty to the community," she insisted. "I've been on the HOA board for 8 years. We have standards." That's when I decided to end the charade. "Officers," I said, reaching into my back pocket. "Along with my license, I'd like to show you one more thing." I pulled out a leather badge holder and flipped it open. Inside was a gold federal badge, stamped and authenticated, along with an ID card showing my position as a senior field investigator with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. The silence that followed was deafening. I continued, "My job involves investigating violations of housing laws, including HOA overreach, civil rights abuse, and discriminatory enforcement of community rules." Both officers looked at each other, then at Cheryl. "Ma'am," the taller officer said, suddenly much more stern, "we are going to strongly suggest that you return to your home and refrain from making any further false reports. Misuse of emergency services is a criminal offense." Cheryl's mouth opened, then closed. She turned without another word and scurried back across the street, her clipboard bouncing against her side. The neighbors were stunned. A few began murmuring. One even clapped quietly. The officer handed me back my license. "Sorry for the inconvenience, sir. Enjoy your afternoon." "Thank you," I replied, nodding. "And thank you for handling this professionally." As the officers drove off, the crowd slowly dispersed, though the energy in the air remained thick. For the first time that day, I felt like I truly belonged, not because I had proven anything to the neighborhood, but because I had stood my ground, calmly, firmly, legally. What, Cheryl? What, Karen? Didn't he know? Was that the moment she tried to weaponize the HOA against me? She set something in motion she wouldn't be able to stop, Because I wasn't just another neighbor. I was the very person the HOA never wanted to deal with. And this was only the beginning. The moment Cheryl retreated across the street, tail tucked and confidence deflated, I knew this story was far from over. This wasn't just a single confrontation, it was the beginning of something much bigger. What she didn't realize, and what most of the community was about to find out, was that I wasn't simply going to let this go. Not out of spite, not because I needed revenge, but because, for the first time, I realized that my role, my profession, and my personal experience had all collided in a way that demanded action. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, replaying every detail in my head. I went over the encounter again and again. The tone in her voice, the way she spoke with absolute authority, the lack of hesitation in calling the police over something so trivial. But what disturbed me most wasn't just what she did to MIT, was what that behavior might mean for others. If she did this to someone who knew the law, someone trained in calm confrontation and conflict escalation, what was she doing to those who didn't have that advantage? What about the single mother new to the area? What about the elderly man who might feel intimidated? Or the immigrant family still navigating life in a new country? I opened my laptop and began researching the HOA's history. Didn't take long to find troubling signs. Public records showed this HOA Maple Grove Estates Association had been the subject of multiple complaints. Not formal lawsuits, but letters to city officials, anonymous posts on local forums, and even a few clips from neighborhood watch meetings posted to YouTube. The names were different, the faces changed, but the pattern was the same: unjust fines, selective enforcement, abuse of HOA rules, and a particular board member always at the center of it, Cheryl Wilson. The more I read, the more furious I became. But I didn't let that fury consume me. I let it focus me. The next morning, dressed in business casual, I returned to my laptop and began compiling a formal investigation briefing. Not as a neighbor, but as a federal agent doing his job. I filed an official request through HUD channels to open a preliminary review into the Maple Grove Estates HOA. I drafted a compliance audit framework, citing fair housing regulations and HOA operational bylaws. I reached out to city records requesting public complaints and financial disclosures. And then I made a few calls to other agents in my department who had investigated similar cases. Within 2 days, I had everything I needed to start holding this HOA accountable. But I didn't want to surprise them with a letter or show up with a citation. I wanted to send a message in person, so I attended the next HOA board meeting. Held in the community clubhouse, the meetings were usually quiet affairs, 10 to 15 regulars, mostly retirees, seated in folding chairs, sipping lukewarm coffee, while Cheryl and her allies ran the show. That night was different. Word had spread about the incident on my lawn. People wanted to know what had really happened. Some came curious. Some came defensive. Some came because, like me, they had a story. When I entered the room, conversation stopped. I walked to the front and placed a thick manila folder on the table before the board. Cheryl, seated at the center, immediately stiffened. I introduced myself not as Mr. Carter, new neighbor, but as Agent Carter. Senior Field Investigator, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Whispers. A few cell phones quietly lifted to take photos. "Yeah, I'm here tonight," I said clearly, not to make accusations, but to clarify a pattern that has emerged. A pattern of discriminatory enforcement, HOA overreach, and potential civil violations. I pulled out documents, annotated HOA violation notices, minutes from previous meetings. Even handwritten complaints from residents who felt powerless but hadn't known where to turn. One letter from a young couple fined for painting their door a non-approved shade of blue ended with a chilling line. "We're scared to speak up. She controls everything." Cheryl tried to interrupt, but I raised my hand. "You'll have time to respond, Mrs. Wilson, but first, I'd like the residents to speak." And they did. One after another, people stood up. An elderly woman tearfully described how she'd been fined for having weeds in her yard while recovering from surgery. A man shared that Cheryl had tried to stop his children from playing in the cul-de-sac, claiming noise violations. A black couple admitted they felt they were being targeted because of their race, citing petty infractions that none of their white neighbors ever received. The room shifted. The fear cracked open, and something new, something powerful took its place: accountability. I presented the final piece, a recommendation for federal oversight pending a formal compliance investigation. The board was stunned. Cheryl, for the first time, looked genuinely afraid. Within 2 weeks, Cheryl resigned from the board. HUD launched its official audit. 3 other board members stepped down voluntarily. A temporary committee was installed with city assistants to manage community affairs until a new election could be held. Mandatory training was implemented, policies rewritten, fines reviewed, and community trust slowly began to rebuild. But perhaps the most poetic moment came quietly. One Sunday afternoon, a few weeks later, I returned to my front yard with a fresh glass of iced tea. The chair was in its rightful place. The sun was warm, and across the street, Cheryl peeked out from behind her curtain. She didn't come outside. She didn't say a word. But I raised my glass slightly and smiled, because this time, the silence wasn't complicity. It was change. Change was slow at first, but it was happening. I could feel it every time a neighbor waved hello with more warmth than before, every time someone walked past and lingered to chat. People who had once been quiet started speaking up. New voices rose where there had only been fear. The Maple Grove Estates neighborhood wasn't perfect overnight, but the air felt lighter, freer, like something heavy had finally been lifted. Still, I knew one act of exposure wasn't enough. Cheryl may have stepped down, but the power structures that enabled her hadn't disappeared. So I made a decision. I was going to stick around. Not just as a homeowner, but as a force for permanent change. I joined the interim HOA Oversight Committee not as a watchdog, but as a bridge. I didn't want the neighborhood to swing too far in the opposite direction, from oppression to anarchy. Order wasn't the enemy. Abuse of it was. I wanted to help rebuild a structure that worked for the community, not against it. The first few meetings were tough. We had to sort through dozens of old cases, disputed fines, revoked privileges, community complaints that had gathered dust in locked cabinets. I personally contacted residents who'd been wronged, offering mediation, apologies, or at the very least a voice in what came next. Many were hesitant at first, unsure if this was just another game. But slowly, they came around. We instituted a new policy. Any HOA board member accused of discriminatory enforcement would be subject to an independent review. We rewrote the bylaws so no one person could wield unchecked authority. We set up anonymous feedback forms, hosted community nights, and even created a neighborhood mentorship program for new residents. Real change, I'd learned, wasn't about dramatic gestures. It was about persistence, transparency, willingness to admit when things had gone wrong and then fix them. I remember one moment especially. An elderly man named Harold came to speak at a meeting. He'd lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else, quiet and solitary. For years, Cheryl had bullied him with noise complaints, for playing jazz records in his garage. But that night, Harold stood tall. "I was here before the bylaws," he said, voice trembling but proud. "I'm glad to finally feel at home again." That was the heart of it. Feeling at home. I began to host coffee mornings from my porch. Nothing fancy. Just a few chairs, a table, and 2 thermoses, one regular, one decaf. Neighbors came by, talked, listened, laughed. I heard stories from all walks of life and migrants. Veterans, young couples, single parents. I met a man who'd fled political unrest in Venezuela. A woman who worked 3 jobs to put her daughter through college. A retired firefighter who still jumped at the sound of sirens. And through it all, I never stopped watching. Not in a suspicious way, but in a careful one. I kept notes, followed up on complaints, made sure no one started sliding back into old habits. I wasn't trying to be the new sheriff in town. I just wanted to be a neighbor with integrity. Eventually we held new elections. This time, the turnout was massive. People who'd never shown up before lined up out the door. Ballots were cast. New voices were elevated. And when the votes were counted, I was elected president of the HOA. I didn't run for the title, but the neighborhood asked, and I answered. The night of the results, I stood at the same podium Cheryl once ruled from and gave a short speech. This community doesn't belong to one person or one board. It belongs to all of us. From now on, this HOA doesn't stand for Homeowners Association. It stands for helping our area, because that's what we're here to do, help, not hurt. Erupted in applause. And as I stepped down from the stage, Harold patted me on the back and a young boy ran up to high-five me. That's when I knew this was home. Not because of property, not because of laws, but because of people. Change was slow at first, but it was happening. I could feel it every time a neighbor waved hello with more warmth than before, every time someone walked past and lingered to chat. People who had once been quiet started speaking up. New voices rose where there had only been fear. The Maple Grove Estates neighborhood wasn't perfect overnight, but the air felt lighter, freer, like something heavy had finally been lifted. Still, I knew one act of exposure wasn't enough. Cheryl may have stepped down, but the power structures that enabled her hadn't disappeared. So I made a decision. I was going to stick around. Not just as a homeowner, but as a force for permanent change. I joined the interim HOA Oversight Committee not as a watchdog, but as a bridge. I didn't want the neighborhood to swing too far in the opposite direction, from oppression to anarchy. Order wasn't the enemy. Abuse of it was. I wanted to help rebuild a structure that worked for the community, not against it. The first few meetings were tough. We had to sort through dozens of old cases, disputed fines, revoked privileges, community complaints that had gathered dust in locked cabinets. I personally contacted residents who'd been wronged, offering mediation, apologies, or at the very least a voice in what came next. Many were hesitant at first, unsure if this was just another game. But slowly, they came around. We instituted a new policy. Any HOA board member accused of discriminatory enforcement would be subject to an independent review. We rewrote the bylaws so no one person could wield unchecked authority. We set up anonymous feedback forms, hosted community nights, and even created a neighborhood mentorship program for new residents. Real change, I'd learned, wasn't about dramatic gestures. It was about persistence, transparency, willingness to admit when things had gone wrong and then fix them. I remember one moment especially. An elderly man named Harold came to speak at a meeting. He'd lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else, quiet and solitary. For years, Cheryl had bullied him with noise complaints, for playing jazz records in his garage. But that night, Harold stood tall. "I was here before the bylaws," he said, voice trembling but proud. "I'm glad to finally feel at home again." That was the heart of it. Feeling at home. I began to host coffee mornings from my porch. Nothing fancy. Just a few chairs, a table, and 2 thermoses, one regular, one decaf. Neighbors came by, talked, listened, laughed. I heard stories from all walks of life and migrants. Veterans, young couples, single parents. I met a man who'd fled political unrest in Venezuela. A woman who worked 3 jobs to put her daughter through college. A retired firefighter who still jumped at the sound of sirens. And through it all, I never stopped watching. Not in a suspicious way, but in a careful one. I kept notes, followed up on complaints, made sure no one started sliding back into old habits. I wasn't trying to be the new sheriff in town. I just wanted to be a neighbor with integrity. Eventually, we held new elections. This time, the turnout was massive. People who'd never shown up before lined up out the door. Ballots were cast. New voices were elevated. And when the votes were counted, I was elected president of the HOA. I didn't run for the title, but the neighborhood asked, and I answered. The night of the results, I stood at the same podium Cheryl once ruled from and gave a short speech. This community doesn't belong to one person or one board. It belongs to all of us. From now on, this HOA doesn't stand for Homeowners Association. It stands for helping our area. Because that's what we're here to do, help, not hurt. The room erupted in applause, and as I stepped down from the stage, Harold patted me on the back, and a young boy ran up to high-five me. That's when I knew this was home. Not because of property, not because of laws, but because of people. Months passed, and the neighborhood began to shine not just outwardly with cleaner lawns and updated homes, but inwardly, in the way people looked at each other, spoke to one another, supported one another. It was no longer a collection of houses guarded by rules. It had become a community of stories, struggles, and shared victories. One spring morning, just after dawn, I was sitting on the same front porch where it all started, a tea in hand. Jazz humming gently from my phone when a moving truck pulled up next door. A young couple stepped out, carrying a baby in one arm and a small box in the other. They looked around nervously, unsure if they were about to be welcomed or watched. I stood, walked across the lawn, and smiled. "Welcome to Maple Grove," I said, extending a hand. "Can I help you carry that?" Their relief was instant. A few other neighbors soon joined. Within an hour, that porch had become a scene of laughter, introductions, and shared donuts. The way it should have always been, that day I saw it clearly. What had started as a quiet act of sitting in my own yard had become a movement, a ripple that turned into a wave. Cheryl had built her power on silence and fear, but we had replaced it with something stronger: connection, empathy, and courage. As the sun rose higher, I looked around and felt proud not of titles or roles or even the victory, but of the simple truth that one act of resistance, backed by principle, had transformed an entire neighborhood. And I knew, deep in my heart, that if Karen ever returned or if another took her place, we'd be ready. Because now, this community didn't fear power. It had become powerful. The end. HOA Karen called the cops because I sat in my own yard. Then they found out who I am. His isn't just one story. This happens in neighborhoods like yours. Subscribe now, because next time, it might be your lawn, your family, your rights. It all started on a warm Sunday afternoon. It's a kind of day where the sun casts golden reflections through the branches of towering oak trees, and the soft, rhythmic hum of suburban peace rolls through the air like background music in a dream. This wasn't just any Sunday. This was the first weekend in years where I wasn't on the clock, traveling cross-country for work, or crashing at hotels with sterile lighting and paper-thin walls. This Sunday was mine. The very first one in my new home. After years of relentless work, endless meetings, red-eye flights, and apartment hopping, I had finally signed the papers to a modest but beautiful ranch-style house nestled in one of the quieter neighborhoods just outside the city. It wasn't flashy. It didn't have marble countertops or a 5-car garage, but it had something more valuable: peace, privacy, and permanence. This house was more than just a roof over my head. It was the embodiment of everything I had worked for, symbol that I had made it through the grind and could now claim a little patch of earth as my own. So naturally, I wanted to savor that feeling. I remember waking up that morning feeling unusually calm, kind of calm that seeps into your bones and whispers you're finally home. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, made a simple breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, and opened the blinds to let the soft morning light pour in. I didn't even turn on the TV. I wanted to hear the sound of birds, of distant lawnmowers, of life unfolding slowly. I spent the morning unpacking the last boxes, photo albums from my childhood, books I hadn't read in years, small mementos I had collected from different states and cities. It was like opening a time capsule of my life.